back. Today we're going to be talking about one of the postmodern principles of design called appropriation. And appropriation is an exceptional strategy for helping to create meaning in artwork. Right? But at the same time, it's fairly complex and requires a in-depth understanding of culture and as well as art history. Okay, so let's start taking a look at what appropriation is and how we're going to be able to move forward. Okay, so what we need to be aware of is that appropriation is actually the act of taking someone else's work and using it for yourself, but without the owner's permission. Now, this can also sound a lot like plagiarism, right? Which is why we need to start thinking about how we are using the image in order to actually, quote unquote, make it your own. Okay, so there in art, there's a very long tradition of utilizing this strategy in order to be able to sort of make social commentary or to critique things from the past. And we'll go into that in a little bit more. Right, the whole concept is actually based on the Latin term appropriare, which literally means to make one's own. Right, so this process it requires considerable thought and exploration. And before we can begin, though, on exploring what appropriation is, I think it's really important that we start to think about art education as a means by which this whole practice kind of evolves from. So one thing that artists do, and they've been doing for a very long time, is copying the work of others. So here we have an image of Anubis weighing the skull of a scribe Annie from the Book of the Dead. And this particular image comes from approximately 1275 BCE. Right? This is just over 3,000 years ago. And in ancient Egypt, the style that the Egyptians used in their artworks, whether it's sculpture or in drawing or and relief, lasted for more than 1,000 years. It lasted a very long time, and that's because they had a very strict code in which the artist was required to copy exactly pre-existing works. And through this practice of copying, the style of the culture was maintained for a very prolonged period of time. When we get into the Renaissance, which is approximately 1400 CE, we start to notice different shifts happening. So the Renaissance was pretty much seated in Italy, and the Italian practices sort of dominated Western cultural production. And as well, the way in which artists learned was highly influential in terms of the development of the style and the concepts that were being used. So a studio apprentice, known as a garzone, was basically the person who kind of did the grunt work within the artistic studio. And the garzone was typically a young person, right? They were learning the trade of what it meant to be able to create an image, right? And they often started their career by being a model, right? They were the person that older apprentices were using to draw from. And they had to learn from the very beginning, sort of at this point, like, how does the body feel to be in certain positions in order to create natural, lifelike appearances? Right? But as the garzone starts to gain more experience, they get older, they start moving away from being the subject of the explorations and learning of other students to doing the menial tasks around the studio, such as preparing surfaces for painting, mixing the pigments, etc. Right? And again, as they continue to grow and mature, the garzone then begins to copy drawings from the master and their design book, right, which was perhaps the most valuable possession that a master artist had. And their job was simply to recreate, right, to copy the drawings of the master in order to learn the techniques. Once that skill was developed, then the the Garzone would be allowed to draw from statues or casts. And the main idea here was to be able to convert the three-dimensional world onto a two-dimensional surface. But again, the Garzone was not doing anything original. They were simply copying what already existed. And once that was mastered or learned very, very well, they would be introduced to basic learning techniques. And as the techniques were refined, then they would be invited to begin participating in the creation of the paintings of the master. And they were assigned the less important parts of the composition. Eventually, young young artistic trainees would become or achieve what is known as the journeyman status, which means that they are working towards the creation of their own masterpiece that they would then present to the Artists Guild in order to receive the status of master for themselves, right? So again, right embedded into the training is this whole idea that copying is an essential part of the artistic process and skill development. And not just in terms of being able to replicate what is in front of the eyes, but understanding of composition and those important design decisions that help to create meaning and communicate the intended message. Once we get into the 17 and 1800s, we see the rise of the Art Academy, which are formal kind of government-run institutions, and their whole job is to train the artist through very prescriptive modes, as well as regulate who has access as well to the artistic market, right? And again, you will notice that in this system, right, there is a huge degree that is put on the idea of copying, right? We haven't touched on the notion of appropriation yet, right? Because appropriation is a much more complex conceptual skill, right? Whereas a lot of the training in these areas is based on literally copying, right? But what the main transition that happens is that the copying artists then recognize that as a means of making commentary. So with that said, we're going to jump in and start taking a look at some of the original artworks that have been created throughout art history, as well as some of the appropriations that go along with them. So the first image I'm hoping you are going to recognize as Leonardo da Vinci's The Mona Lisa. Da Vinci created this in 1503 to 1506, and it is an image of Lisa del Giocondo, who was a wealthy silk merchant's wife. Right, so this her identity was actually only really discovered in around 2005 by art historians working at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. Right? And she's always been this very mysterious person. There's a sense of enigma about her. What is she smiling at? Who is she looking at? And this sense of mystery sort of has captivated audiences as well, right? Because there's a sort of there's a sense of intimacy, but also a sense of distance. There's also a lot of mystery around this particular image, as it's an image that looks complete, but also through spectral analysis, there's a sense that it may not have been fully rendered as well, and that areas kind of look unfinished. It's an image that Da Vinci carried around with him pretty much for his entire life. And in fact, the image itself had been stolen, and there's a cultural fascination with this image. And if you go to see the Mona Lisa in person today at the Louvre in Paris, right, it's very, very difficult to actually get up close to see the image, and it's also highly protected with guards and bulletproof glass, right? And in fact, the image itself is now literally priceless. Okay, so this image has sort of become a means of defining what art is, right? It's a commodity. It's got monetary value. It's got a story behind it, right? And as a Western culture, it has been elevated to a status that is unlike any other image in the history of art, right? Um, in the early 1900s, Marcel Duchamp was an artist sort of exploring the nature of art. And he was, how shall we say, he was questioning what art was and the value of art. He was influenced by a number of other artistic movements that were happening in the early part of the 20th century and was associated with highly influential people within the art world, such as Peggy Guggenheim. Right? And an important aspect of his work can be reflected by this quote: "The creative act is not performed by the artist alone. The spectator brings the work in contact with the external world by deciphering and interpreting its inner qualifications and thus adds his contribution to the creative act." Right? So he's recognizing that there's a dialogue that happens between the artist, the artwork, and the audience or viewer. So the title of this work is called LHOOQ. And when you pronounce the letters in in French, it sounds like LO show which is an auditory pun of she is hot in the ass, right? Which is a statement that refers to sexual restlessness, right? There's a lack of social propriety, right? And it seems like it's an attack on the Mona Lisa itself and traditional art and the institutions of the early 20th century art world. Right? But what Duchamp is really doing here is he's questioning what is art and what is the value of art, as he has done in many of his other art pieces through his ready-mades and found object art. Right? So he's questioning the nature of art itself and its relationship to the world and to its audience. And he's only able to achieve this by actually borrowing a reproduction of the Mona Lisa and manipulating it. So appropriation, right? You can see that he has taken something, right? But he has added to it. He has manipulated it. He has changed it in some way in order to make it his own. And thus, by making those alterations, is able to make a interesting critique of the world around him. Another image that we can take a look at is Jacques-Louis David's very famous painting, The Death of Marat, that was painted in 1793. So David was a neoclassicist. His emphasis was on the ideal form and taking a look at harmony and balance, right, in terms of being able to kind of create these very poignant images. What's unique about this particular painting is that the subject matter is actually from his time. It's a contemporary figure, which is very different than many of the other neoclassical images of the time, which were typically representations from the ancient world that were put into positions in order to make social commentary. But this is Marat himself after he was killed the by Charlotte Corday. She was an aristocrat, and she had blamed Marat for a massacre that was resulting in the deaths of about 100,000 people. Right? He was against the French aristocracy and the monarchy. Right? This is the time of the French Revolution, in which the French people were recognizing that the they were building the wealth of those that were in power, those that were rich, and that they were suffering greatly. And Marat was one of the key organizers. He was a journalist that was making comment about the inequities in his society. Now, one of the things about Marat is that he had a skin condition that required him to take cold baths. And here, right, you can see him literally in that bath with a stool next to him, right? And he's got a board that's draped across his bathtub, and he's still at work, right? Indicating that he is such a hard-working person that he never takes a break, and that his full life is dedicated to supporting the cause of the French people. Now, what's particularly interesting here is the pose and posture of um, Marat, and we need to understand where this pose comes from that gives this particular image such power and resonance. And we're going to take a look at Roger van der Weyden's painting called The Deposition, which is about Jesus being crucified and then him being removed from the cross. Right? So we see the cross up in the top portion of the picture space, which is an extension here. And then we also then see, right, the figures carrying Jesus away. And what's kind of fascinating here is the repetition of this particular gesture, right, of the hanging, the lifelessness of, in this case, Jesus as well as is Mary, right? They kind of mimic each other. Now, in order to kind of make the connection and see what Jacques-Louis David is trying to say about Marat, we need to understand who Jesus is. All right, so within the Christian faith, Jesus is considered to be the Savior, and that he sacrificed himself. He allowed himself to be killed in order to save all of humanity. He died for the sins of the world, and that those that chose to believe in him could gain access to heaven and have eternal life. Right? So he is Christ is a savior figure. And if we come back and we take a look at Marat, I'm hoping that you will be able to recognize that the pose and the gesture is remarkably similar. Right? Take a look at that arm that extends down in that very limp way. The visual similarities are extremely striking. And through making this association, Jacques-Louis David is taking a different approach to appropriation than Marcel Duchamp, right? But it is just as powerful. It's through appropriating or copying that gesture, David is making a very poignant commentary on who Marat was. Marat was considered to be a savior for the French people. Right? So again, hopefully you can see the similarities between the two poses. Our next examples start way back in ancient Greece. So these are figures that come from the Parthenon, which is part of the Acropolis complex in Athens. And the story that is being depicted here is about the birth of Athena, who was the patron goddess of Athens, but also the goddess of war. Right? And the story goes is that Athena was born from Zeus's head after he had a headache. Right? And the figures that we are looking at in particular are not Athena or Zeus either, but rather the figures that are bearing witness. These are the people that would have seen this event take place. They are the ones that pass down the story in order to give it credibility. Right. So when we see the continuation of the act of borrowing in Raimonde's etching called The Judgment of Paris. And this is after a painting of Raphael that is now lost. This etching was created in 1520. Right, so the Judgment of Paris is about the events that are leading kind of up to the Trojan War. The goddesses of Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena are upset at not being invited to a wedding, and they're trying to figure out who is the most fairest. Right? Hera is the goddess of power. Aphrodite is the goddess of love. Athena is a goddess of wisdom. And so basically what happens is the three goddesses come up to Paris and say, like, which one of us is most beautiful? And Paris needs to decide. And in order to influence his decision, each of the goddesses promise Paris a gift. Hera as provides power as a gift, Aphrodite love, and Athena wisdom. Right. In the end, Paris chooses Aphrodite's gift of love, and then this is the event, one of the events that kind of leads to um, Paris falling in love with the daughter of the Trojan king and precipitates the launching of 1,000 ships. But again, if we take a look at the overall composition and keeping in mind that idea of bearing witness, hopefully you've had some time to identify where there might be some visual similarities from the Parthenon configuration. So if we come back to the sculptural piece, take a look at the figures here, and once again, see if you're able to locate them within Riomonde's composition. I'm hoping that you've been able to see them over here. Really, it's just the one figure, okay? And the pose, right, of the reclining male and the interaction with these two figures is going to become important as well. Okay, so take a look. We have the people bearing witness that are telling the story, right, that are going to be relating the events. So the triad of figures in the bottom right hand corner then make their way into Manet's painting Luncheon on the Grass from 1863. Manet is a realist painter, and he very much transitions from sort of the romantic and neoclassical style into a very new way of looking at the world through the styles of realism. Right? But again, what we're focusing on today is the idea of the pose. Right? So here we have the reclined figure. The composition of those three is also very, very similar, right? The woman looking out, the reclined figure, right? And the other man that is sitting next to, right? And again, we need to keep in mind this overall story of bearing witness, right? That the people here are meant to kind of like tell the story. So in this image, we see Manet's brother, and we also see a very, very common prostitute at the from the time, right? And she is the one that is nude here in the center, right? And it's a fairly intimate space, but it's also kind of strange the way in which this female who is entirely nude in the middle of a park is staring out in an almost confrontational way out to the viewer. She's saying, I know that you are looking at me, right? I am witnessing, right? You looking at me, right? And going back and forth. So there's a very interesting dialogue that is starting to develop, right? Especially on this, utilizing these figures of bearing witness. And we're going to take another look at another piece by Manet. Okay? So, but before we can get to Manet's work, again, we need to understand the history. So here we have Giorgione's Sleeping Venus. This was introduced as a Renaissance painting, really with the main emphasis being on the landscape in the background. And Giorgione's sort of the story or narrative in this particular piece is the idea of the woman being the giver of life and nature. But there's also clearly a sense of sensuality. And we start to see and investigate the concept of the male gaze, the objectification of women, right, as sort of narratives that need to be explored when taking a look at a work in which we see the nude female form being sort of literally kind of laid out for visual consumption by the primary and intended audience, men. Okay? So Manet, right, again, utilizes this composition, right, in his painting called Olympia from 1863. And again, we see the use of a well-known prostitute from the time. And when this was shown, it was highly controversial because what we see now is, again, this prostitute who would have been very well known in high society. And she is looking out at the viewer. right? And when this was presented at the salon, or the main exhibition for the first time, right, it created a lot of discomfort, right? Because here are men with going to a very elitist social gathering with their wives and looking at a woman in a painting who many of them would have known on a personal level, and this woman is now looking back at them and their wives and creates a very, very interesting social dynamic. Okay? So we can extend this notion of the gaze even further when we take a look at Yasumasa Morimura's photographic work, right? So now it's not necessarily just about the male gaze, but it's also about disrupting the gaze in its entirety, because here Yasumasa, as a male artist, is the main subject of his work. He photographs himself into historical paintings. So now we are disrupting the male gaze even further by taking a look at the assumption that the main viewer is a man and the subject is a man. So we are seeing the male gaze, but we are also starting to investigate the heterosexual male gaze. Okay, so one more quick example. Okay, so Grant Wood is an American painter, and he created this image called American Gothic. It was 1930, so just after the um, stock market crashed in 1929, and we see an image of a Midwestern couple with their farmhouse behind them. They're standing strong, they're hardworking individuals, and right, it doesn't just have to be artists that can appropriate, but we also see this taking place in advertising as well. Right, so the same idea here, we are taking something, in this case, the um, fashion company is borrowing or taking the image of Grant Wood that has these associations of strong, hardworking individuals and literally superimposing their product into the composition in order to make the same case for the products that they are selling, that their clothing is hardworking and sturdy as well. Okay, so basic overview of appropriation. Right? One of the main tasks that you need to be thinking about as you work towards creating your own works, right, are what strategies can you use in order to appropriate. Right? And these are some of the suggestions that you might want to consider. Right? You could consider substituting, you could insert something new into the composition, you could add or extend a composition that's there, you could remove elements, you could allude to something or make a vague visual reference similar to what David did. Parody, which is an exaggeration for comedic effects, use of satire, or looking at completely recontextualizing a work as well. Okay? So appropriation, okay? Simply put, it means to borrow somebody else's work. Okay? But in a more thorough and accurate way, it means to borrow somebody else's work without their permission necessarily in order to make a critique or comment on the original or society as a whole. Okay. Good luck. If you have any questions about this fairly complex approach to making art, please let me know. And best of luck in your creative endeavors. See you later. Bye.